Hello students, welcome to chapter 20. I apologize ahead of time for giving you guys work over the break, but actually this review is actually going to be a lot easier than the project I normally assign. So really you should be thanking me for giving you work over break. This chapter is not that bad, but there is a lot of stuff going on in this chapter. So while the concepts aren't that difficult, we're going to be talking about a lot of things. Our goal here is to figure out what happens in this country post-Reconstruction that leads us to the Spanish-American War. There's going to be some consequences of several things that we've already talked about, like the rise of big business, etc., etc. And this chapter kind of just keeps building. Remember, our eventual goal is to get to World War I, so we have to figure out how we're going to do it. It's not really an easy process. This is just another big piece when it comes to that. So, without any further ado, let us get started. This is an era of gradual change that we can believe in. But seriously, this is actually going to be a time period of significant political change. We are in an era of pretty hardcore political idealism and changes, even though I'm going to go ahead and guess you're not going to be able to name a president after the year 1877 and before the year, I don't know, 1894. I'll wait. Didn't think so. There are four of them. There are four different presidents during this time period, and each one is elected by a super narrow margin. Political leadership in the House is going to switch 5 times, and 7 new states are going to be added to the Union. This is a crazy, drastic time period of growth and of change in this country. In fact, the political parties begin to change and grow and morph during this time period, so the political parties aren't going to look the same as they did as of the time of the Civil War, just to confuse you guys even more. Political parties are going to do whatever they can to lure in voters. Again, the elections have been so close and the margins of victory have been so narrow that the political parties are going to do and say whatever it takes to encourage people to vote for them. Coincidentally, this is going to be a time period of extreme political corruption while this is going on. Political parties will lie and say they'll give their constituents anything so that way those constituents will vote for them. Sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Anyway, at the same time as all this is going on, the government is going to leave the business sector alone. Now, the logic might be, well, businesses are making money, so why bother? But at the same time, businesses are going to start taking advantage of their workers, and the government is going to do little to nothing to try to stop this. So what's going on here? Well, let's talk about the prevailing political ideologies of the time period. First thing we have is this idea that the government does not belong and cannot interfere in the business sector. The government has no role in the business sector. The word we're going to use here is a word that you probably remember from last year. It's called laissez-faire. Laissez-faire literally means hands off. It's probably French. It's got the laissez in there. You have to pronounce every single letter. It's got to be French. So many vowels. Anyway, this French idea is basically going to be that the government should be hands off. Let business do whatever it's going to do. It will grow and be successful if the government does nothing. The problem here is that, yes, businesses do become successful, but they have to take advantage of someone, i.e. a lot of someone's, in order to pull this off. The other major idea we have during this time period, we kind of talked about it before, is this idea of social Darwinism. Darwin's theory, of course, of not only of natural selection, but of also survival of the fittest. The idea here being that the most successful businesses or most successful people are going to prevail. This idea of social Darwinism is going to be applied to business, to economics, to world affairs, and to imperialism, all things that are going to be happening during this time period leading us to World War I. So just as how we say that America is the greatest country on earth, so it should spread its democracy to people that don't want it, i.e. Hawaii, maybe at the same time, if a business is successful, then that should be the most powerful business. If your business fails or you fail as an individual, it's because you are weak, not because of anything else. The government, more importantly, is not here to protect you. As such, this becomes an era where local politics really matters a lot, and national politics means nothing. There's a reason why you guys have not heard of the presidents of this time period. It's because the presidents don't really matter during this time period. They're kind of inconsequential. Why? Because the government is going to be very hands-off and just let things happen the way they're going to happen. Let's talk about each party. Let's start with the Democrats. Now, the Democrats are going to control the American South during this time period. They're going to believe that the Northerners and what we call the Northern Carpetbaggers are the ones that ruined the South. They're going to demand a limited government in the economy and lower tariffs. Because again, high tariffs hurt the South. They don't produce anything except for cash crops, even after the Civil War. So the South is pretty much always against tariffs because it hurts them when they trade internationally. And this group is going to be really popular among immigrants, especially Catholics. And again, we'll be talking about the whole immigration thing as we go. On the other hand, we have the Republicans in the North. Obviously, they're going to control the North. This is still the same Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln's time. They support this idea of take that back. Their ideals are supported by this thing called the Grand Army of the Republic, which just basically means that there are a lot of Civil War veterans in the North that are going to back up the things the Republicans want to do. If anything, the Republican Party is stronger than the Democratic Party during this time period, but it's not really by much. And again, what happens here is that the Republican Party is going to be kind of put off to the side in exchange for a stronger business and private sector in America. They're going to run a series of former military generals during this time period. Most of our politicians at even the highest levels of office, including our presidents, are former military generals. And they're going to have pretty much universal support from the freedmen in the South and also from the incoming immigrants that are Protestant rather than Catholic. This is also an era known for extreme political corruption, and I mean extreme political corruption. Remember that dude? Oh, what was his name? He was that crazy general in the War of 1812. He is basically the only war hero from the War of 1812. He's going to basically reform the entire political structure after the corrupt bargain in the election of 1824. Of course, you know I'm talking about Andrew Jackson. Remember that idea he had where he said that he wanted to get rid of everyone that wasn't his political party. He wanted to get rid of all the Jeffersonian Republicans after the era of good feelings. He wanted to get rid of all these Republicans that were in office. So instead, what he does is he does this thing called the spoils system, or the rotation in office system, where the idea was to get rid of all those people that weren't his political party and instead install a bunch of people that believed his political party. Yeah. Remember that? If not, listen to the last minute over again or go back to the previous chapters. I'll wait. Anyway, the problem here, when he did that, the problem ended up being that we had a lot of really, really bad people in government offices simply because of their political affiliation. So let's just pretend that I'm a Republican. Well, when I come into office, I'm going to give all my friends that are Republicans jobs, regardless of their qualifications. Turns out the duties of government are kind of complicated. So if you're just going to give those to just anyone based off their political beliefs, that's not going to be enough to actually effectively run the government. So what do we have to do? Well, as the next 50 years go by, we're going to have this constant change of people in office, but the overall theme here is that a bunch of corrupt people are going to be in office, mainly because of things like the political bosses that are going to, like Boss Tweed, are going to give immigrants jobs. Well, immigrants don't know how to speak the language in many cases, so giving them a job that requires literacy might be a problem. And then we're also going to have a lot of other corruption because, again, people are given jobs for the wrong reasons, not because of their merit, M-E-R-I-T, merit, like this picture here in the center. They're given a job because of their political affiliations, not their ability to do it. As the late 1800s are rolling on, the government says, look, we have to fix this. We have to change how this is going down. A new idea began to emerge during this time period. Again, we're going to try to get rid of corruption here. The idea here is that if you work for the government, or you are what we call a civil servant, it should not go to you based on your political affiliation, but instead go to you based off of your merit or ability to do the job. This is also necessary because as new technological innovations come along, the government and the people are becoming more complex. and the government's being more active in people's daily lives. We can't just have some schmuck running a part of the government. We need qualified people. Enter the Pendleton Civil Service Act. The year is 1883, for those of you types that care about things like that. Certainly I don't, as long as we tell the story in order. The idea here is that if you want to become a civil servant, you want to work for the government, you have to pass a competency exam. You have to prove that you're actually capable of doing this. This also made it illegal for political candidates to actually deal with civil servants. There should be a separation between the people running for office and the people that are working for the government, and the idea being that it's going to get rid of some corruption. Eventually, a majority of these jobs are going to be cleaned out, and we're going to have qualified people. In fact, this is going to be one of the first times in American history that women are actually going to be able to enter the workforce working for the government. Turns out one of the people that are really at the forefront of bringing about equality in this regard is going to be the government, even though the government's going to systematically make sure that women don't have the right to vote during this era. At the same time, they're going to be one of the largest employers of women in America during this era. Something to think about. Our government is crazy. Again, the Civil Service Reform and the Pendleton Civil Service Act are basically here to get rid of corruption, to stop all these weird things that the political machines were doing and the political bosses were doing, and instead have the government be run by competent people who got their job based on their ability, not just because of who they were or what they said they were. Let's knock out a bunch of elections in a row. Again, I'm telling you as a historian here that these presidents aren't drastically significant. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Mullen, you've had that book that says, the forgotten presidents, and it's supposed to be about the stuff they did. I know, but really, as far as our story is concerned, they're not really doing enough, so we're not that concerned with him. Or with them, I should say. Let's talk about this election. We'll start with the Democrats. They choose this guy named Winfield Scott Hancock, who's actually going to be a military general. And on the other hand, we're going to pick Republicans. Or the Republicans are going to pick this guy named James Garfield, who, of course, the cartoon cat is named after. And the vice president here is going to be Chester A. Arthur. Now, I know that you know this for a fact, that presidents tend to win in this era because of their better facial hair. But the picture I have chosen for today, for this unit, look at this guy here on the right. You are looking at the magnificent facial hair of Chester A. Arthur. That is a look that needs to come back. He has by far the most epic facial hair in all of American history, as far as I'm concerned. When it comes to presidents, and by the way, he's going to become president. Spoiler alert, Garfield gonna die. Chester A. Arthur has by far my favorite presidential facial hair. I think this is a look that if anyone running for office, I think I would vote for them. Now, granted, they might be some crazy political party, but in general, this is probably going to be the political party I would vote for based on the facial hair. I'm just saying. In fact, maybe that's how I'll make my next vote. It'll be whichever candidate has the best facial hair or the best potential for good facial hair, because it needs to come back. Lousy JFK getting rid of that kind of stuff. Anyway, with all that in mind, Garfield's barely going to win this election. It's a very close race. And again, this is the election of 1880, so we've had Republicans in charge again for a while. They've been in charge since the Civil War, and they're going to remain in charge through this election. But Garfield is going to die. Ironically, Garfield's going to be shot by a guy that wants to get a civil service job, but he can't get one. So he's going to be shot by a guy that says, "Hey, I'd love to have a job." And Garfield says, "No, I'm not going to give you a job." And he goes, "No, seriously, give me a job." And Garfield's like, "No." So a couple days later, that guy shoots him. And here's how useless the presidents are during this time period. Garfield is going to be incapacitated for 80 days. He's going to be dying slowly for 80 days, 80 days, and the government doesn't fall apart. We don't have a president in this country for 80 days, and you wouldn't know the difference if I didn't tell you. That's really how this period works. That's why I said the presidents don't really matter here. Unfortunately, because Garfield is dead, Chester A. Arthur is now in charge, and Chester A. Arthur is really not a solid president because he doesn't really know what he's doing. Turns out you need to have a little bit of experience if you want to be president. Historical side note, the guy that shot James Garfield was a member of this thing called the Oneida community, which was a crazy cult in New York City. And eventually the leader of that cult, once the cult is broken up, forms this place called Orange County. Now, this is only relevant because the Oneida community was actually a bizarre sex cult, and when it broke up, obviously, those guys, still being those crazy, weird people that they are, came down to this weird, isolated place, really far away from the American government, and set up this place called Orange County. Oneida community, Orange County. Makes you think, doesn't it? Hey, by the way, if that story interests you and you want to know more about it, you guys should be reading the book Assassination Vacation by Sarah Vowell. I'll give you extra credit for it, and she tells that story in much better detail. But we have to continue. Chester A. Arthur does nothing as president that is of any historical consequence, so let's keep moving. The year is now 1884, and the Republicans are going to select a new guy. His name is James G. Blaine. He's a really good speaker, and he wants to get rid of all this political corruption. Again, the Pendleton Civil Service Act has just been passed, and he wants to get rid of all this political corruption. Unfortunately, he was a pretty corrupt individual himself, so he ain't going to win. And instead, again, look at the facial hair. The facial hair is minimizing, but Grover Cleveland has it, so he must win this election. Cleveland was the governor of New York and was known for stopping corruption in that city and in that state. So obviously he's going to be a great choice because the American people are going to be really big on getting rid of political corruption. Unfortunately, he had this thing called an illegitimate child from a really strange relationship, which of course is frowned upon in our elected officials. He's going to end up winning a very close election because he's out open and honest about this child, whereas other presidents that have done things they probably shouldn't have always tried to hide it. By the way, Grover Cleveland is the only president that we know of that actually was involved in executing people. He executed people when he was the police chief in New York. Anyway, he wins this election pretty closely. Let's discuss him as president. Grover Cleveland is an interesting president, mainly because he's going to be president on two non-consecutive occasions. He is going to be the president in the election of 1884. He runs for 4 years, and then he gets kicked out of office, and someone else is elected. And then 4 years later, he comes back as president. So he is the only president to ever serve on two non-consecutive occasions. And Grover Cleveland's also interesting because he's a big supporter of this idea of laissez-faire government politics. He doesn't think that he should be in charge. In fact, he had the same policy towards the people. He felt the government was not there to help you. And this is going to be the prevailing thought in America really for the next 50 years. Americans don't believe the government is there to help them. So when everything falls apart in the Great Depression, spoiler alert, the people don't look to the government for help because they don't think the government's supposed to do anything. That goes completely against everything that we think of in America today, where the government is always there to help us and have our backs. But the prevailing thought in America was that no, that's not the government's job. Cleveland's also interesting because he gets married while president in the White House. Interesting. Anyway, the big thing that happens during Cleveland's presidency is going to be this question over tariffs. Now, tariffs at this time period are necessary because they raise revenue for the United States and they protect the United States businesses from foreign competition. In fact, with the tariffs the government had in place, the United States actually had a significant budget surplus and had no need to tax its citizens because what we were doing was taxing all the products that we are now selling because of all this industrialization. It's pretty awesome. But Cleveland is actually concerned. This is going to be the strangest thing you may have ever heard me say, which is saying something. He's concerned that the government has too much money right now. I'll stop. I'll say that again. Cleveland is concerned that the government has too much money. His logic is, if the government has too much money, then legislators would want to use that money to fund things that are unnecessary. He thought that a budget surplus would actually lead to more government corruption, and we're trying to get rid of corruption during this time period. Unfortunately for Cleveland, his stance on these issues really upset business leaders, veterans, immigrants. It pretty much upset everyone that he felt this way. So he's going to get kicked out of office in the next election based off of his beliefs. Let's discuss that election. The year is now 1888, and Grover Cleveland is going to be running against Benjamin Harrison, a new character in our story. He's the grandson of William Henry Harrison, by the way. He's going to argue that Cleveland's going to end up destroying America by lowering tariffs. That's going to be the bad thing for the U.S. economy. Cleveland's going to end up losing this election despite winning the popular vote, because that's just not important in this country for some reason. Harrison immediately is going to raise tariffs and make sure that more money is coming into the United States. And he's going to make sure he takes care of the veterans that voted for him, because again, Harrison was actually was involved in the military. Unfortunately, the problem in America is that the government is ignoring the average Americans, and that's only going to last for so long. In fact, let's pause in all these presidential stories. Let's pause and say, what is going on with the average American during this time period, and how do they respond to the government ignoring them? So let's talk about those people that the government is ignoring. Mainly, we're going to start talking about farmers. Now, it's important to remember that life in the Midwest, or the Great Plains, whatever you want to call it, is not easy. Farming's dangerous, which is a problem. There are going to be many droughts and poor crop yields. Turns out the American Midwest is not this place that's great for farming like we like to pretend. Turns out it's not. It's really volatile, and with early farming techniques, it's very difficult to farm. And many farmers are going to lose their jobs or end up starving. The farmers are going to reach out to the U.S. government for help, but they're going to be ignored. In response, they're going to form their own support group that we call the Grange. This is not a political party per se. It's more of a group of people that are going to work together to try to get political change. That might sound like a political party, but it's not quite what it is. They're going to use their collective might by joining together, and they're going to tackle two things that are really making their lives more difficult than they need to be. The first area they attack are going to be the banks. Bankers are going to treat farmers unfairly. They're going to be really high, expensive loans that farmers are unable to pay back. So farmers are going to stop dealing with banks. They're going to deal in cash or specie only and not deal with credit, i.e. credit what you get from banks. They're only going to work in the money that they actually have. The other area that the Grange is going to attack are going to be railroads. Because railroads would not work with small farms. Basically, the idea here was that the railroads were going to start charging farmers more expensive amounts to ship their goods, which again is not really fair because the farmers only have so much money, and they're being charged more even though they're not taking up that much room on the train. This leads us to a Supreme Court case, Munn v. Illinois, in 1877. States had set up these things called Granger laws, which forced the railroads to set standard prices for shipping for whoever needed it. The railroads are going to say, wait a minute, that's not fair. Well, let me backtrack and explain this again to make sure we understand. Basically, the Grange movement is going to set up a bunch of laws that say if a railroad wants to travel through a state like Illinois, they're going to have to charge fair prices to everyone that uses the railroad. If the railroad's not going to charge fair prices, i.e. to farmers, then they can't go through that state. That's a Granger law. So basically the railroads are going to be forced to stop being jerks to the farmers. The Supreme Court is going to rule that this is constitutional. It probably wouldn't rule that way now, but it's going to rule that this is constitutional, and the Grange is going to start to develop some power. It actually leads to the passage over time of this thing called the Interstate Commerce Act, which basically allows the government to oversee and investigate the railroad industry and to make sure that they're using fair business practices with everyone. It's going to establish this thing called the Interstate Commerce Commission to do that, to basically make sure the railroad is playing fair. That being said, this is actually going to be a pretty weak government agency, and the farmers are still going to be taken advantage of. In fact, the Grange, as we know it, is going to break up. But it's important to note, this is the start of a political movement here. What's going to start to happen here is that people realize that they can't expect the government for help, so they have to start helping themselves. I want you guys to keep that in mind. It's actually pretty important to this story. So despite these successes, the Grange movement is going to fail. Dealing in cash is going to be really difficult because nobody has cash or specie or anything. That's going to make it difficult. The railroad companies have all this money, so while the Grangers are going to try to set up these laws, the railroads have more money. They'll just bribe government officials to get what they want, and they do. Eventually, the price of grain is going to recover, farms start making more money, and then it's not so bad the railroads are charging so much, and everything is okay, and everyone forgets about what happened here for a little bit. But again, the seeds of political change have been sown. The people realize that they have to work for themselves because the government is not going to help them. That's basically the point of the Grange movement. Okay, so the Grange was a group of people trying to make their lives better and hoping the government would listen, and they don't. But they die away. But the group that forms from them, this is going to be the start of a political party that's going to drastically change the United States as we know it, and it's going to lead the push to make the government relevant. This is going to be a pretty big change what they end up doing. The farmers and the citizens force a change in the laissez-faire idea of the government, and this is how it happens. Let's start. This movement is going to grow out in the South, out in the far West. This is going to be a group of farmers, hence why it's called the Farmers' Alliance. In the South, many white small farmers fell into extreme debt and had to leave their farms to become sharecroppers. Farmers would get together and start to discuss their problems, like that their farms are all failing and that things aren't going well for them. And soon, this movement, which starts out with a couple of people complaining, is going to end up becoming a movement that encompasses over 4 million American farmers by 1890. 4 million people in America during this time period is a very significant political force. They wanted the government to help and to do some action to help the farmers, to reduce the tariffs, and to have a couple of other things that we haven't talked about yet. Something called a graduated income tax, which basically means that the more you make, the more taxes you pay. They wanted the public, not private companies, to control railroad lines, and they were really concerned about the coinage of silver for some reason. We'll talk about that in more detail later, but for some reason we go through this weird fight between gold and silver in this country during this time period. It ultimately doesn't really make a huge difference over which one we pick, but man, the farmers were freaking out about it during this time period. Anyway, this group of people that starts out as a group of farmers are eventually going to make a political party to actually like run for president. And they're going to have a political party which is going to represent their ideas. It's called the Populist Party, and it forms in 1892. The Populist Party, their ideas contain all those things that we've just talked about, while also pushing for some other changes in how the government works. The first thing they want is the direct election of senators. Back in the day, the senators were basically appointed by the government. The Populist Party said that wasn't fair and that senators should be elected by the people. They also want some other election reforms. The first one is called the initiative, which the idea here is that it's a bill that's proposed by the people, not politicians, and can be voted on by the people. So that's an initiative. We do this in California all the time. Perhaps you've heard of one like Prop 8. So that was a gay marriage initiative that was submitted by citizens, not by the government. That's how that works. We call them propositions here in California. The next change they wanted is what we call a referendum. Referendum is when you are voting on an initiative. So an initiative is a bill submitted by the people for approval, and when you vote on that bill, that is called a referendum. The last thing that the Farmers Alliance wanted was a recall, which means they want the voters to have the ability to remove someone from office if they really suck. That's basically what a recall is, and that's what the Farmers Alliance wants. Now, the Populist Party as we know it does not really gain any real political office, and they never become president, but their ideas become so popular, and the fact that the government needs to be reformed itself becomes so popular that it's going to basically make a big change in the United States, and it's going to basically overthrow everything we know about the government. It's actually kind of cool that a group of angry citizens are the ones that are going to change everything about this government. Let's talk some more about how that all worked. Actually, I lied. We're not going to talk about that because your textbook puts it in the next chapter. How convenient. Instead, let's talk really quick about the next election. The same players are involved here. We're going to have Grover Cleveland versus Benjamin Harrison. And Grover Cleveland's going to win. Congratulations. There's really not much to this story that you have to know. But again, I like to tell you about each election. So there you go. Grover Cleveland wins. What you might be noticing, though, is that the Populist Party with that guy Weaver are starting to make some gains, specifically out west, and they can no longer be ignored. That's pretty much it. You got that. We're good. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about what's going on with freed slaves after Reconstruction. What's going on with them in the American South? This is a story we've kind of hinted at but haven't really gone into a lot of detail on, and now is a good time to go in a lot of detail. Again, your textbook kind of throws this story in here where, as far as I'm concerned, this could be an entire chapter. Your textbook just throws this story in here. So I'm going to try to do it justice, but again, be reminded that I have to work in the parameters of your textbook sometimes as well. So, after the Reconstruction Act, after the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction is going to be over in the South, and the whites in the South are going to try to redeem the South. And basically what happens is the experience of freed slaves, of these black Americans, is going to get significantly worse. The first goal here is the first goal for the whites, I should say, is to disenfranchise or to discourage the blacks from voting. We talked about some of these direct and indirect methods. Of course, the direct methods would be violence and intimidation, but the indirect methods to make people stop voting would be things like the literacy test, which you guys took a couple weeks ago, poll taxes, which were taxes required to vote that day, and property ownership requirements. Those are all things that were done to discourage blacks from voting because they wouldn't be allowed to. Another type that we haven't talked about was this thing called the grandfather clause, which is exactly what it sounds like. If your grandfather could vote in the 1850s, so could you. Obviously, no black man's grandfather could vote in the 1860s, so that's going to be another means of making sure that blacks do not vote. In fact, by 1900, hardly any blacks bothered to vote in the South at all, and until the 1960s, this is going to continue. Really, almost for 100 years after the Civil War, blacks are not going to vote because of all of these methods done to stop them from voting. The second goal was to promote racial segregation in the South. The second thing that whites wanted was to promote racial segregation in the South. Now, this went beyond a simple separation of whites and blacks. This is going to be a way, really what whites want is they want to bring back that social hierarchy that existed before the Civil War. They want to bring that back. They want blacks to be a lower class citizen. Black prisoners are going to be taken into this idea called a convict lease system, where blacks had to work on chain gangs to work on railroads, coal mines, and cotton plantations. The idea here was that criminals that were in jail for whatever reason could be loaned out or rented by white farmers. They would pay the jail a small fee. They would get as many workers as they needed to work on the plantations for free labor, because again, they're convicts, and they'd be there working all day. This is basically a way of keeping that whole slavery system going. And of course, sharecropping is still continuing in the South. There's going to be some other ways to basically make sure that blacks are kept down in the American South. And we're going to do something a little bit different. We're actually going to listen to a song. The song is called... We're going to do something a little different. I want you guys to listen to this song. This was a song that was written about some events in the American South. So I want you guys to, if you are watching this on your phone or whatever and you're driving or whatever, I've heard people do that, I want you to stop and I want you to look and I want you to read these lyrics as the song goes on. The song is very powerful and it has a very important message, and I want you guys to listen to it as it is going. So please follow along and listen with the song.
Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop.
It's not often that I show you guys something like this. It's not often that I show you dead bodies. And these are not maybe perhaps posed dead bodies from the Civil War. These are dead bodies that led to the creation of this song. This is a lynching in the South. I believe it was in the 1910s. I could be wrong about that. But this is actually, post 1900s. Or, I take that back. Post 1900 lynchings. Now, this is the best way to keep blacks subjugated in the South, according to whites. The physical intimidation and the sight of these swaying bodies was what made the big difference. Of course, I'm talking about a lynching. Over 100 blacks were lynched every year in the South from the year 1880 to the year 1900. Most of these men rarely had a trial, and they could be hung for any offense. This is a true symbol of white superiority in the South. Over 80% of all lynchings were against blacks, often done with a crowd of whites around, like you see in this picture here. To make things even more sadistic, there is a direct correlation between the price of cotton and lynchings. When the cotton prices fell and economic times were hard in the South, lynchings rose. It's my sad duty to inform you about how these actually happened. The way that you see a hanging or an execution in a movie is that there is a platform with a gap, and then that gap or whatever falls, and the person with the rope around their neck falls through the hole, it snaps their neck immediately, and they die. That's not how lynchings in the South were done. Very often what would be done would be that a black man in this case would be physically beaten, as you can see in these pictures. He'd be put on the ground, typically face down. They would tie a noose around his neck, throw a noose over a tree, and then they would attach that, the rope. They'd attach the rope to a horse, and the horse would start walking. When you are hung, the way that you die is from your neck snapping and going over your breathing passages, and your neck collapses over your breathing passages, and you basically choke to death. That's essentially how you die when you are hung. That is a quick process when you are on a gallows and your body drops down quickly. But in this case, the horse would move slowly, and the victim, I guess you could say, their neck basically would have their entire weight going from the ground up. It was a much more slow and agonizing process, and it would take between 20 and 40 minutes to die this way versus having the quick snap of the neck for an execution. But this is the symbol of the South. These lynchings occur. We have records of these lynchings occurring all the way up through World War II. I'll say that again. That's not some far distant past. Your grandparents lived through World War II. World War II is when this was going on. This is what keeps blacks subjugated in the South. This is what prevents blacks from voting. We don't have accurate numbers of how many blacks were lynched, but it's in the thousands. Several thousands, actually. This is a serious problem in the South, and here's the worst part. This is going on, and the Populist Party does nothing about this. The whites in the North do nothing about this. The government does nothing about this. Congress does nothing. There is no one speaking for black men and women in the South anymore. This racism and this hatred happens, and there is nothing being done. And nothing is going to be done until after World War II. I want you guys to keep this in mind whenever we talk about hatred or racism or inequality. This is what it leads to. This is an image I want you guys to keep in your heads, hopefully for the rest of your lives, but definitely for the rest of this class when we talk about the upcoming civil rights movement. And there's actually more to the story that goes along with this. The question we have to ask ourselves now is, can the government do anything about discrimination? Is there something the government can do to make people that don't like each other like each other? You could argue that Reconstruction tries. Reconstruction is the process of rebuilding the American South, but also by force, the American North was basically forcing the North and the South to play nice. So you could argue that Reconstruction was the government trying to force people to like each other that don't. But after the Civil War and Reconstruction are over, the question becomes, can the government really force people to like each other? Specifically in this case regarding race. The civil rights cases of 1883 basically say this. The Supreme Court rules that Congress has no authority to stop private citizens from practicing discrimination. The government can't make you like someone. In this case, in the South, they can't make whites like blacks. The government can't legally force you to like each other. Now, can the government force you to treat each other equally? Well, we'd like to hope so, but we'll talk about that in a second. The government can't make people like each other. The government really can't step in and stop racial hatred. As horrible as that sounds, that's the truth. This leads us to perhaps the most important Supreme Court case of this era. And we're going to tie the Supreme Court case into many others when we talk about the Civil Rights Movement later on. But this case is Plessy versus Ferguson. The year is 1896. Here's the problem. In the American South, there were a lot of black codes and other laws that were set up that basically separated whites and blacks. We call this segregation. The problem here is that a gentleman named Homer Plessy, he is a black man, buys a ticket to sit on a train. Now this train had separate cars for whites and blacks. The black car was full, the white car was mostly empty, so Homer Plessy, having legally bought a ticket, decides to sit in the white car. He is going to be fined, and he's going to be kicked off the train. This case makes its way to the Supreme Court, and the question becomes, wait a second, if we have this thing called the 14th Amendment, and we have equal protection under the law for all races and all citizens, doesn't that mean that segregation and these segregation laws and the separation of whites and blacks, doesn't that basically mean that that is no longer valid and legal? So not only should this, fine be taken away from Homer Plessy, shouldn't this idea of segregation go away entirely? Because again, that violates the fact that everyone is a citizen now. You can't discriminate against citizens, they're citizens. Here's what the Supreme Court says. The Supreme Court says that no, segregation is permissible. You are allowed to have separate facilities for whites and blacks, so long as they, and make sure you underline this, are separate but equal. So the facilities that you have must be separate but equal. If you're going to have a train car and have one car for whites and one car for blacks, that means that those two facilities have to be equal if they're going to be separated. This is going to be done for bathrooms. This is going to be done for drinking fountains. Whites and blacks aren't going to walk on the same side of the street in the South. In fact, if you were to go to a restaurant back then, whites would be able to sit in the dining room on the inside, whereas blacks would have to walk around the back of the building next to the kitchen, and there'd be a window in the kitchen, and that is where they could order and stand in the back. That way whites and blacks couldn't even be in the same restaurant together, even if both paid equally. This is the American South. What's really interesting is that you can go to Disneyland and actually see this. If you guys want to over break, I'm not going to give you extra credit or anything, but you can see something like this happening. In downtown Disney, there is a restaurant called, I believe it's the Jazz Bakery. It might be the Jazz Kitchen, but it is a New Orleans style restaurant. There's jazz music playing. It's one of my favorites. I love it there. But what's interesting is that there is a big, beautiful restaurant designed to look just like New Orleans, and then off to the side of it, there's a little side door to a little smaller restaurant attached to it, where you can get simpler foods that you can eat with your hands. You can get beignets, which are awesome, but it's a subtle hint and a subtle recall to what's going on in the American South at this time period. You can sit in a nice, big, beautiful restaurant, or you can stand up and go to this side door and get different food. That's what happened in the South. That is segregation. That's what that means. What starts to happen is that a bunch of laws that we call Jim Crow laws are going to be passed. These are basically going to be laws that require things to be separate but equal. That's what happens. The Supreme Court is also going to rule that poll taxes and literacy tests were constitutional. And all of these policies, the Jim Crow laws, the poll taxes, the literacy test, they're all going to be in effect until 1954. So not only are blacks being lynched in the South and kept away from voting and kept away from their rights, they're also forcibly separated from whites by law until the 1950s. This is America, kids. This is the America we live with. History has shown us that the North knows this is happening, but doesn't do anything to stop it because they want to avoid another civil war or another sectional strife. Let's have a quick talk about this idea of equality. Now, I'm going to give you guys two cases. The question we have to consider ourselves, what is the difference between the same and equal? Because what starts to happen is that a lot of facilities in the South are going to be the same, but they are far from equal. So let's take a look at the difference between the same and equal. I'm going to give you guys two cases. Let's read the first one. Two patients come to a doctor with a headache. The doctor determines that one patient has a brain tumor and the other patient has a run-of-the-mill headache. What would the doctor have to do to treat these cases the same? Well, if he was treating them the same, he would give each a Tylenol and say, okay, go home, you'll feel better. But that's not treating them equally. To treat them equally, the doctor would need to make sure that they do a bunch of tests on the person with the brain tumor and run some CT scans, some MRIs, do a biopsy, and hopefully remove that tumor, and hopefully the patient will be okay. But the person with the run-of-the-mill headache only needs a Tylenol and some rest and they'll be fine. So again, there's a difference here. To treat them the same would be to give them the exact same treatment. But to treat them equally would be to make sure both of their needs are met. The Supreme Court says that facilities have to be separate but equal. What starts to happen is that in the American South, they are separate but the same, or really grossly unequal. Let me give you another example, that way it sticks in your head. Two students try to enter a school that has stairs leading to the entrance. One student is handicapped and the other is not. So, what would have to be done to treat these students equally? Well, if we're going to treat them the same, they're both going to have to go up the stairs somehow. The handicapped student and the non-handicapped student are both going to have to make it up those stairs. If we treat them the same, the only option is stairs. But that's not equality. To treat these students equally, you're going to have a ramp to help the handicapped student make it up to the school. So again, this is the difference between the same and equal. In the American South, what starts to happen is that facilities are separate, but they are far from the same or far from equal in the American South. I hope this guy's helped you to understand the distinction between the two things. It's important. Okay, time to switch mental gears again, and let's go back and talk about elections. So The election of 1892 is a repeat of the election of 1888. There's really not much new here, except for the fact that the Populist Party runs a candidate. And Cleveland is a little bit more conservative now. Well, whatever. Cleveland wins, but this is actually still a pretty close election. If you look at the popular vote, things are actually getting a little close here. But even then, the Populists are going to take several electoral college votes out west, and they're going to be seen as a growing national presence. Suddenly, politicians could no longer just ignore them in favor of business. And this is actually going to be the start of things changing in this country, where it doesn't happen just yet, but eventually the government is going to change. The Populist Party is going to gain enough momentum where the government has to recognize that they exist. It's going to be a slow change and a gradual change. We're going to introduce that change in the next chapter. We're not really going to talk about it in this one, but that change is coming. I know, it's a little bit of foreshadowing, but unfortunately that's just kind of how these things work. Don't worry, we'll get to progressive era, the progressive era soon, I promise. All right, moving on. Okay, we have to talk about a bank panic again. Again, I know a lot of things are happening in this chapter, but it's not the end of the world. Now, this panic is a little complicated and it has a lot of effects and there's a lot of things going on. I'll try to explain it the best I can, but in general, as long as you know that a really, really bad bank panic happened in 1893, you'll be fine. I'm going to give you a lot of the details because it's important to know them, but at the same time, there's a really bad panic in 1893. In fact, this one is so bad that we pretty much called this the worst economic crisis in America until the Great Depression, which was really only a little bit worse than this. So this is a really bad economic crisis. And hey, what do you know? It's only been about 20 years since the last one. So the culprit for this bank panic, and again, remember your formula, the culprit this time is going to be the railroad industry. It's the most powerful industry in America, so of course, if there's going to be a problem with the economy, it's probably going to happen because of the railroads. What happens in this case is that railroad companies are going to issue stock, which are basically partial ownership in their company, and they're going to issue more stock than what the railroad company was actually worth. This is going to be like that robber baron, really bad idea thing going on. Development out west is going to stall during the 1890s because the frontier is closed and they're going to have a bad crop yield one year. So the railroad companies are going to start losing a lot of money. And now there's all this stock that's actually worthless. Again, I know, it sounds complicated. It's a big confluence of events here. If that wasn't bad enough, normally if the United States goes through a financial problem, we can kind of like look to Europe to kind of help bail us out. Maybe they'll increase their trade with us to jumpstart our economy, and Europe can do it the opposite if we're doing well and Europe is failing. But during this time period, there's a huge financial crisis in Europe as well. So European companies start selling stock in American railroads, and if that wasn't bad enough, the European companies did not want to have paper money in exchange for selling their stock. They wanted gold. What starts to happen is that as stock is sold and as companies go out of business, people don't want paper money. They don't trust it. They want to have actual gold instead. That's called being on the gold standard. People want to have gold. Now, the gold standard is much more complicated than that. I'm sorry, that's the wrong way to describe it. The gold standard is more of a fact that gold is how we value the paper money in our country. So if you have a $20 bill, there must be an equivalent of gold somewhere in this country that relates to that $20 bill. That's what the gold standard means. The problem is we're running out of gold. We haven't really found any new gold in a while. And every time a bank panic happens or there's a failure, people are going to want this gold for themselves. They're not going to want to have paper money. They don't trust it. So the U.S. government starts giving away its gold. Well, that's the basis of our economy, so that's not really a good thing. On top of that, as this bank panic just lumbers on and on and on, government resources start to disappear. Ironically, it turns out that Cleveland was right. It's a bad thing if the government has too much money. Veterans were expensive, Congress started building a whole bunch of crap, which is called pork spending, and suddenly the country runs out of money because they weren't being frugal enough. Cleveland was right the entire time. 4 years later, so by 1897, this bank panic is still going with no end in sight. A third of the nation's railroads are completely bankrupt. The problems with the railroads hurt every other business. Remember, the railroads are the most important industry, but every other industry is built off the railroad. Can you imagine if the internet just suddenly disappeared or stopped stopped working for 4 years, what that would do to every other thing in America, that's how important the railroads were. Crop prices are going to drop. Farm values drop. Unemployment's going to rise up to 25%. Nearly everyone in this country is affected by this cycle, and it will not end. There starts to be public protest against business and the government, and these begin to sweep the nation, demanding a change. Unfortunately, that change isn't going to come for a couple more years because something else happens that's going to distract America. Let's talk about what goes on. I don't have a picture that goes along with this, so here's a picture of the Mona Lisa. Apparently, it's not all that interesting to see because it's like really small, and there's just a crowd of people taking a picture. I mean, I get the whole idea of going on a vacation and seeing something rare and unique like this and taking a picture of it, but there are thousands of other paintings in the Louvre which are just as impressive. And, like, someone got a much better picture online. Like a professional one, not behind several inches of glass, which is going to reflect off of anyway. Things like this drive me insane. Things like this drive me nuts. This is why I don't like crowds. This is why I hate people. Anyway. How do businesses respond to this huge, giant financial crisis? Remember, the government is laissez-faire. The government does not care. No matter how bad things are going, the government doesn't really care. So businesses are going to have to solve this problem. Ironically, Cleveland's going to think that this is how the market is structured, and these bank panics are natural and normal, and there's nothing the government can or should do about it. Unfortunately, the United States government is like running out of gold. The entire basis of our economy is disappearing. Someone's going to have to step in. Eventually, Cleveland decides to ask a bunch of banks for he basically goes to the banks and asks them for a loan. He asks them for a bunch of gold to keep the economy running. And this is going to save the U.S. economy, but the American people are now convinced that the government is no longer there to help them. This becomes a giant slap in the face to the American public. They're really upset. They don't trust the government. And Cleveland is going to be universally hated by the American people and the Democratic Party for his actions as president. What happens because of the Panic of 1893 is the fact that it leads to the death of this laissez-faire government. It's going to lead to the really the shattering of the political parties. The Democratic and Republican parties are going to shatter, and a new party is going to rise out of the ashes. The problem is you don't get to know who that is until we come back from break. But basically, all this horrible stuff happened in the 1890s, and finally the American public said, this is enough. We need to reform this government. And they make a government that's much closer to what you guys know. As I've stated to you guys many times, this is Mr. Mullen's weakest period in American history. I'm not going to lie to you, it is. And to be honest, the longer I've been teaching this class, the more I wonder why this specific thing is so important. Why this election is so important, and why this debate between gold versus silver is so important. The AP exam loves to ask you a random question about this, and I don't know why. I don't think this is that relevant. There's so much more important stuff happening in America. But for some reason, the AP exam likes asking you about this, so I will do my due diligence and tell you what's going on. But personally, I don't think it's that important. Anyway, because of the bank panic of 1893, because America is running out of gold, the American public starts to go, why are we using gold? Like, gold, we're running out of it. In fact, maybe we should switch. Instead of having gold be the basis of our economy, why don't we use silver? We have just found a bunch of silver out in silver mines out west. We have an abundance of it. It naturally occurs more than gold. So why don't we base our economy on silver? And really, the entire election of 1896 is over what we should base our economy off of. Not how do we solve the bank panic, or hey, there's some crazy stuff going on overseas, maybe we should focus on that. No, it's should we use gold or silver to determine what paper money looks like and means. Again, I think this is completely unrelated or unimportant in American history, but what do I know? I wasn't alive then. What ends up happening is because a big fight breaks out, and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are going to basically disagree. On the one hand, we have the Democratic Party, led by this dude named William Jennings Bryan. Now, this is the first time that WJB enters our story, but he won't be the last. This dude is like I don't know. It's going to seem inappropriate to call him a leech because I'm sure someone online is going to see this and say, "How dare you say that about William Jennings Bryan?" But he's just kind of like this leech or this tick that's just kind of hanging on to America, and he hangs around for like 40 years. You'll see his name on these elections over and over and over, but he constantly keeps losing. Anyway, William Jennings Bryan is going to promote the interest of the Western farmers. You can see he's represented here in the red. He really conquers the West. He represents the West. He also says that gold is a bad idea. He doesn't like gold. Now again, a lot of silver is coming from places like Nevada, Colorado, and Wyoming. So if he wants their votes, he's going to support silver. He gives this speech that we call the Cross of Gold speech because he says in it, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Again, I don't get why it's important. But you may be asking yourself, where did the Populists go? They kind of disappeared. Well, the Populist Party is going to be absorbed mainly by the Democrats in this time period. They're going to absorb the Populist Party, and it's going to blossom into something else, but that's going to be in a couple of weeks. I know, I'm sorry I have to keep saying this, but that's just kind of the way it is. In this election, the Republicans are going to select this guy named William McKinley. William McKinley, nice guy. You probably like him. He's really smart. He promoted the average worker and was a fan of the gold standard. McKinley wins this election mainly because he, is more popular than Bryan. He says has a better message. Ironically, the Democrats adopting the Populist Party platform actually led to their downfall. The Populist platform didn't really help out immigrants or factory workers, who were a majority of the U.S. population during this time period, especially in the North. So really, while the Populists have some neat ideas, they haven't really caught on with the voting public just yet. Again, this is one of those stories. I'm telling you this big long thing. I promise you this will all make a lot more sense once we get to the end of it. Really, if all you know about this election is that William Jennings Bryan likes silver, you'll be fine. You'll be fine. Okay, so now that all that ridiculous economic and political crap's out of the way, let's get to the fun stuff. Let's get to imperialism. Let's get to a war. That's much more interesting to talk about, and it's much simpler to understand. That's what America's all about, war. Something's going to happen during this time period, and it's something you've already talked about in your world history classes, but it's going to infect America as well. Really, what starts to happen during this time period is that countries start to do this thing called imperializing or imperialism. The idea here, the idea of imperialism, is that stronger countries should extend their economic, political, or military control over weaker countries. A strong country, like America, should take over weaker regions and use those regions and exploit them for their benefit, namely for raw materials. This basically ties in with the idea of nationalism, the idea that my country is the best, so we'll conquer every other country that we want to for our benefit. This has a tie, really, all the way back to Manifest Destiny for the United States. We felt that the entire American continent was ours, so we took it. It also has its ties in with the Monroe Doctrine. We tell Europe to stay out of the Western world. That's for the United States and for democracy. So this idea of imperialism is basically the same thing America's always been doing, but with a different name. But now we're going to leave the continent and start reaching out overseas and extending our influence. Now, the idea here, the reason why a country imperializes is that you're looking for more raw materials and more markets to sell your stuff, but there's a bit of nationalism here. My country's the best, so it should take over the world. So that there's two competing things going on here that we're going to want to talk about. In fact, let's talk about the factors for American imperialism. Why does America do this? First, we do this because we want military strength. There's a book that's written that really changes the United States and changes, really, world history in general. It's by Alfred T. Mahan, and the book is called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The argument of this book is that naval power equals military strength. The stronger your navy, the stronger your military. On top of that, a truly strong navy requires bases all over the world, so the U.S. needs to expand into new territories, specifically in the Pacific. And if you have bases all over the world, it's a really good idea because then you could refuel your ships everywhere that you stop. This is probably the most influential book in the history of any country that touches the Pacific Ocean. That's how important this book is. It changes how we fight wars. It changes why we fight wars. This is the reason why the United States is going to get involved in a war that we'll talk about in a minute. This is the reason why World War II happens. This book really changes how a country feels about itself. It is that influential. Mahan also says it's probably a good idea if we dig a hole through Panama. That way we can sail from California to New York faster. And by the way, that's something we end up doing. The United States does not want to fall behind Europe in military matters. We haven't really fought Europe in almost 100 years, but we never know when one's going to come, so we should really build our military just in case Europe decides they want to take over us. We also have a thirst for new markets. We want to sell our stuff in new places. If the American markets are full and the American economy is kind of in shambles, the best thing we can do is sell the stuff left over to new people. It doesn't require any work. We don't need to employ them. All we have to do is go there and sell them our stuff and take the money back home. If we have a lot of stuff left over, it's a good idea to go sell it to someone. So we have a thirst for new markets overseas. In short, ironically, the American economy is too productive, so we need to have a place to dump all of our stuff and get some money back for it. It's a good way to recoup some money that we've lost in all these bank panics. The third reason why America is going to imperialize and going to start playing in other countries around the world is this idea called social Darwinism. We talked about this before. Social Darwinism basically implies that a strong person should take over a weaker one. We talked about this in regards to business. A strong business should take over a weaker one. Well, you know what? A strong country should take over a weaker one. This also ties in with nationalism. In fact, it is America's duty to spread our culture and our influence around the world to help all the weird naked savages in all these other countries that don't understand how great America is. That way they can be like us. That is social Darwinism. This idea is going to be heavily advocated by one of my favorite presidents, Teddy Roosevelt. He becomes a president later, though, but he's a big fan of this idea. Social Darwinists like Teddy Roosevelt are going to clamor for war because a war would be a good way to separate the strong from the weak. It would also make the country more patriotic. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt's famous quote during this time period is that, "I should welcome most any war. This country needs one." You know what would really solve our economic distress and the general, he'd say the word malaise, but the general weird feeling we have in this country? A good old war. That would really solve a lot of our problems. War would solve America's problems. So let's put Mahan's ideas to practice. Let's start with the very first place we decide to extend our dirty claws. Let's talk about Hawaii. Hawaii is going to be a great place to extend our influence. Again, if the goal of Mahan and the goal of a strong country is to have a strong navy, and we have to cross the entire Pacific Ocean to get to Asia, we need to have a place in the middle of the ocean, really in the middle of nowhere, to refuel our ships. Fortunately, there are a bunch of islands that really have not been developed yet. The islands, of course, I'm talking about are going to be Hawaii. We'll have a very quick discussion today, or right now, I guess, of how America acquires Hawaii. What starts to happen is that the Hawaiian Islands are ruled by a queen. They have a monarchy there. The queen's name is Liliuokalani, which I probably pronounced wrong, so I apologize to any Hawaiians listening to this. But she is the queen of Hawaii. For a while now, she had tried to expel all whites from the islands. The United States had actually sent people to Hawaii before to develop sugar plantations and pineapple plantations on the islands. There are a bunch of American planters that are making a lot of money in this region. What ends up happening is that this dude named Sanford Dole, you've heard of him because you like pineapples just like Mr. Mullen because you are a red-blooded American, or a red-blooded Pacific Islander. Anyway, this dude named Sanford Dole is basically going to lead a revolution on Hawaii. He claims he has authority of the United States, but he really doesn't. He's just this American guy who owns a plantation on Hawaii that doesn't want to lose his land. So he decides to have an insurrection and basically overthrow Queen Liliuokalani, and then he basically offers Hawaii to the United States. And America's like, okay. We didn't want that to happen. That's not what we were intending to happen. We don't want to cause some international war, but yeah, sure, we'll take over Hawaii. And that's where it comes from. The Queen is overthrown. Hawaii is going to be declared a U.S. territory in 1898, and eventually it becomes a state. So where does Hawaii come from? It comes from this idea of imperialism. We want to have more land, and we have Americans on this land already, so we're going to take it. And then on top of that, it's going to be a great fueling station to refuel a lot of our ships. That way we can send them to other countries and do the exact same thing. You know how Pearl Harbor was attacked in World War II? It was a refueling station for a bunch of military ships. That's what we used Hawaii for. That's what Hawaii was for. It's basically just a refueling base for our ships, because our ships are headed other places. Let's talk about some of those places, and in fact, let's talk about a war. Okay, so after Hawaii has been conquered, I guess you can say, now America needs to set its sights on somewhere else. Remember, at this time period, with the frontier being closed in 1893, America needs to imperialize and find other places that we can use for resources, and we basically need a new frontier. All these foreign countries that aren't really having much being done with them, that is a good idea of a frontier for us. Anyway, the next place we're going to have our sight, or we're going to put our sights on, is Cuba. Now, America has wanted Cuba for a long time. In fact, that's actually been something going all the way back to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's day, this idea of taking over that region. Cuba is so close to the United States. Cuba actually has some of the most fertile soil in the entire world. Anything you plant in the ground in Cuba will grow. So America has wanted Cuba for a long time. For about the last 30 years, there have been American farmers and, I don't want to say plantation owners, but there have been large American farms on the Cuban island that were running large sugar plantations in the region that the Cubans were working on. Now, the Spanish government still has control over Cuba, even though Spain has lost control over most of Central and South America by this time period. They still have control over Cuba in the 1890s. The Spanish government's going to move some of the Cuban natives into one central location under direct Spanish control. And the idea here is that the Cubans are going to be moved away from the American plantations on the Cuban land. That way the American plantations go out of business and the Spanish can take them back over. The word that's going to be used here is concentration camps. And they're not the same as the ones during World War II, but that's just what they are called. They're just areas where these Cuban citizens are going to be sent. The problem is the conditions here are abhorrent, they are dangerous, and they are disgusting, and many Cubans start to die under this Spanish control. Now, Americans are going to hear about the atrocities of what's going on in Cuba, and they're going to think, well, maybe something should be done about this. Maybe we can't let this happen to the Cuban people. We can't let the Spanish treat them so terribly. The only problem here is that American newspapers tend to stretch the truth, as it were. Sometimes newspapers will say things that aren't entirely true just to get you guys to read them. You ever heard of a little service called TMZ where they pretty much just make stuff up as a means of encouraging you guys to watch their show or go to their website? Turns out newspapers did the same thing. The worst offender of this is a guy named William Randolph Hearst, who had a newspaper that was called The Journal. By the way, most of the development here in California can be done thanks to Hearst, so we kind of owe him a favor, but at the same time, his newspaper had a lot of lies in it. And you know what sells a lot of newspapers? You know what really encourages a lot of Americans to read and watch the news? A war. William Randolph Hearst wants to make more money. What better way for a newspaper to make money than to encourage America to go to war? Because somebody's going to have to report on what happened in that war, and Americans are going to be curious. So William Randolph Hearst and others like him are going to encourage America to go to war because they can make more money. As awful as that sounds, that's pretty much exactly what happens with Cuba. These lies that he published, we're going to call yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is when you lie about something as a means of, I don't know, encouraging people to read your publication. Many Americans began to become upset or concerned over the plight of the Cuban people. I mean, there was some bad things going on for the Cuban people, but at the same time, William Randolph Hearst made them sound 1,000 times worse than they really were. Hearst makes it worse. I'll let you guys just keep that in your head for a while. However, our president at this time period, McKinley, refuses to go to war. In 1898, the Journal received a letter in which the Spanish government called McKinley weak and corrupt. That letter was never officially written by Spain, but it was published by William Randolph Hearst as a means of saying, hey, look, the Spanish people think that we're dumb. And then, on February 15th, 1898, the ship, the USS Maine, exploded near Havana, Cuba, under mysterious circumstances. 266 men die. This is exactly what Hearst wanted, and the exact reason that Hearst needed to convince Americans to go to war. That way he could sell more newspapers. Spain is going to deny any foul play, say they had nothing to do with it, and historians pretty much agree that Spain didn't have anything to do with it. And Hearst is going to blame Spain for the tragedy. The American public is going to get wrapped up in like, oh man, we have to go to war, we have to go to war. So, pressured by the American public, McKinley, our president, reluctantly declares war on Cuba. But he adds an amendment to the war declaration. It's called the Teller Amendment. So we're going to declare war on Spain. I said Cuba, but I meant Spain. We're going to declare war on Spain over Cuba, but we add an amendment to our war declaration. McKinley says, fine, we'll go to war if we need to avenge the injustice of our ship blowing up and to help the Cuban people. But at the same time, when this war is over, Cuba is going to be a free, independent nation. Cuba is not going to become the next state in the United States. That's the Teller Amendment. We say, fine, we'll fight for Cuba, we will help them get their independence, but we will not take over Cuba as a territory. This is going to make all the imperialists really upset, but this is what McKinley truly believes. Like all good wars over Cuba, the Spanish-American War does not start in Cuba at all. Again, we declare war with Spain to help the Cuban people and to avenge the blowing up of the USS Maine. So, of course, logically, we're going to start this war in the Philippines. I'll just let that sink in for a second. We start this war in the Philippines. Now, why? Well, Spain also had a lot of territory in the Philippine Islands, and that's actually where most of Spain's navy was. So if you're fighting a war with Spain, you have to go to where their navy is. Their navy is hanging out in the Philippines. Spain does have control over Cuba, but really Spain's lost a lot of the Caribbean islands already to independence and revolutions. So if you want to go to war with Spain, you have to go to where Spain is. Spain's hanging out near the Philippines. So this war starts on April 11th, 1898, and it's going to be over a few short months later. This is the most successful war in American history. Let me knock out some numbers for you because I know how much you guys love those. This war, how successful is it? Let's see here. The first battle in the Philippines lasted 6 hours, and it was the most one-sided military victory in the history of the world. Almost the entire Spanish fleet was destroyed in 6 hours. There was one U.S. death in the battle, and it was because of heat stroke the night before. That is the battle in the Philippines. So anyway, the battle starts on May 1st. The U.S. opened fires on Manila, and within days, the U.S. has basically destroyed the entire Spanish fleet. Filipino forces are going to fight both the United States and Spain on land. So it's kind of funny. We're fighting a war with Spain in the Philippines, but the people of the Philippines don't want the United States or Spain there, so they're fighting us on both sides. Good for them. It isn't until the U.S. promises the Filipinos their independence that they join the United States to help defeat the Spanish. And by August 1898, it's over. There are over 350 Spanish men dead, and only one American dies, of course, because of heat stroke the night before. Now, that's it. That's the story of the Philippines for now. The story of Cuba is one, slightly more interesting, and also slightly more involved. The fight itself in Cuba actually isn't going to be any harder. But the problem is many Americans weren't used to the climate and their terrain there. In fact, Cuba has a lot of tropical diseases there that there really is no real cure for, and Americans don't have any natural immunities to. So Americans get sick and die. In fact, most of the deaths in the Spanish-American War are from disease. Disease in the Caribbean, if you want to think of it, is kind of like winter in Russia. You can't stop or prepare for the winter in Russia. It's just going to come and it's going to devastate people. I told you guys before about the Hardcore History podcast. This is what it talks about, and it spends a lot of time discussing diseases and yellow fever and how Americans die. So if that kind of thing interests you, it's about 90 minutes into the podcast. You could hear the story of exactly what it's like. It's pretty gross and gnarly. I think you'll like it. Now, only 10% of the American casualties in this war are from battle. They're mainly from getting sick. That's what this is like. Anyway, the U.S. is going to blockade Cuba and soon is going to make landfall on the island and hopefully take it over. We're going to enter a dude into our story for the first time officially named Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is going to become a very famous president, but right now he was a politician that basically the way to think about him, think of him like a little boy that wants to do a bunch of dangerous things and doesn't really realize that they're real. For example, he is a little boy that was basically hospitalized for the beginning of his life, and he basically always wanted to be a cowboy. He always wanted to be a soldier. He always wanted to be a really big, tough man. But at the same time, he's kind of a really geeky, gangly nerd. So this nerd wants to be this big, tough guy, and he's almost always trying to constantly prove how big and tough he is, when deep down, he's really a nerd. So Teddy Roosevelt's going to put himself in a lot of really dangerous situations, and he survives and he does well, but he might not think these through all the way. In fact, Roosevelt craves adventure. One person that when Roosevelt was president, one of his aides said, "You have to be careful when you talk to the president because you have to remember that mentally he's about 6 years old." Don't get me wrong, he's brilliant, but he has the impulses of a 6-year-old child. That being said, let's talk about one of his impulses. One of his impulses was to basically leave the United States, take a bunch of his rich friends, and go and make a military regiment and decide to fight in the Spanish-American War. They don't really get authority to go. They just basically commandeer their own ship because they're rich. They take all their own supplies and they go to Cuba and start fighting. They're called the Rough Riders. He charges up San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders, and he becomes the really only war hero of this war. He's the only person that we know. Oh, I mean, there's plenty more, but the only person that we care about that fought in this war is Teddy Roosevelt because he was bored, wanted to go hang out with his buddies, and said, "Hey, instead of going fishing or hunting this weekend, let's go fight a war instead." And they do. By July 17th, 1898, Spain is going to surrender. Spain's going to recognize Cuban independence for exchange for us basically mailing Spain a check for $20 million. And Spain is also going to cede the land of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the United States. So within a couple of years, the United States goes from having no land outside of the continental United States to, by the year 1900, the United States is going to control Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, Hawaii, and the Philippines. So in 10 years, we go from basically being this isolationist area, this country, to being to starting to imperialize and taking over all these regions and basically controlling the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. It's a huge shift in how America's run. As Teddy Roosevelt called it, this splendid little war was over. From 1898 until 1902, the U.S. Army controlled Cuba. The U.S. government is going to improve life for Cubans, but this was violating the Teller Amendment, so we have to add another one. In 1901, Congress passes something that's called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment says that Cuba is free, but it's under the protection of the United States. The United States has the right to interfere in any Cuban affair, and the U.S. has access to Cuban naval bases, like Guantanamo Bay. But at the same time, Cuba is basically independent to run itself, but the United States is basically going to act like a big brother and make sure that Cuba plays safely and kind of goes along with what we want. But Cuba does remain independent. It doesn't become one of our states, but we control it and pretty much tell it what to do for the next 50 years. That doesn't go over too well. Cryptic foreshadowing. Hey guys, after I made this video, I decided to add in Dan Carlin's description of yellow fever from his Hardcore History podcast. If you like it, go ahead and listen to the entire podcast for extra credit. I think you guys will enjoy it. I know it's a little long, but it will explain this war in a way that is much better than how I can do it, because he's done a lot more research on it than I have. So go ahead and listen to his description of what yellow fever was really like, because it's kind of gross. I think you'll like it.
Places like Cuba and other tropical areas, you had like general disease instead, or general fever instead of general winter, where the tropical climate created all sorts of diseases that affected everybody, certainly, but affected people who were not used to that climate even more. In Cuba, you had, typhus, malaria was another big one, but the real nasty, scary disease that they had in Cuba was something called yellow fever. Yellow fever is one of the hemorrhagic fevers, like Ebola in Africa. Writer Evan Thomas has a description of what it was like to suffer from yellow fever. And listen to this description and then understand why, if for no other reason, the U.S. would be worried about the situation in Cuba if outbreaks of yellow fever became an issue, especially when you realize how many people are going back and forth between Cuba and places like Florida. Thomas said of yellow fever, quote, "Disease accounted for most Spanish casualties. Death from yellow fever, also called the black vomit, also called yellow jack, the most common of these devastating ailments, was particularly horrible. The mosquito-borne infection essentially melted soft tissues so that sufferers bled from the nose and gums, rectums and genitals, and vomited up something that looked roughly like coffee grounds, but was actually stomach lining and intestine. Howling and ranting as they bled from every orifice, patients had to be tied down in bed so they would not splatter the infection around the wards." End quote. Any disease that makes malaria look good by comparison is pretty darn nasty, and this general disease, comparing it to Russia's general winter, was at least as effective as Russia's weather barrier, because the Spanish at this time period, after years of trying to put down the Cuban insurrection, had suffered a couple thousand casualties due to Cuban insurgents and some 50,000 casualties plus due to disease. The U.S. had to consider both, how a disease outbreak in Cuba might affect the southeastern, portion of the United States, which was also subject at times to yellow fever, but also had to factor that into a cost of any intervention. Whether or not you feared Spain was one thing, but when you put troops in Cuba, what happens if they start coming down with yellow fever? That's a big concern.
Despite America's overwhelming success in the Spanish-American War and our conquering of Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Hawaii, Cuba, and, oh, by the way, we've also attained Alaska a while ago. Despite the fact that America has been so successful, there are many people that are not happy with this change in American policy. Namely, this group of people form, and again, if imperialists are the ones that want to expand, obviously the people that don't want to expand are going to be called anti-imperialists. Well, the Anti-Imperialist League is going to form, saying that they don't like how the United States has changed into becoming this imperial economy and this warmongering country. They don't like that. The Anti-Imperialist League is going to be led by, again, that dude whose name just keeps popping up in our story, William Jennings Bryan. He said that the U.S. to rule over other people was a direct violation of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Now, you can see this election, the election of 1900, let's finally start changing our numbers. The election of 1900 is basically going to be the end of the Anti-Imperialist League, because look at how resoundingly McKinley wins re-election. McKinley wins re-election, and the American public says, no, we are happy with how America is being run. We are happy with this imperialism. We just won a war. Stop being a party pooper, William Jennings Bryan. God, you're so terrible. What's important here is that William McKinley is going to select a new vice president. his vice president is going to be this guy named Theodore Roosevelt, a popular war hero that the American public is in love with. So, McKinley's going to select Theodore Roosevelt to be his vice president. And many people in the government are happy. They're like, oh, good. We've decided to make Theodore Roosevelt vice president. Because, again, the vice president has no job and has no authority and really has no business and no purpose in life. So as long as Teddy Roosevelt is vice president, he's no longer going to be trying to influence American government, influence the policies. Basically, he's just going to sit and be vice president and just rot there. The only thing that could possibly happen to ruin this story, to make things bad for the government, would be if McKinley were to die. But that's not going to happen. Presidents don't die. Or do they? Okay, so a lot happened in this chapter. Let us try to see if we can piece it all back together. I know it's a lot, so make sure you guys don't wait to the last minute to do this. Read this slowly and see if you can put all these different pieces together. I promise you, after chapter 21, we'll take a day or two, and I'm just going to step back and connect every single piece, and you'll see how it all fits. But I understand if you might get a little confused. Just put the puzzle pieces together right now. We'll make it into a big, giant, pretty picture really in the middle of January. This will all become a big, beautiful, pretty picture for you, I promise. Okay, so let's recap chapter 20. The U.S. government is extremely corrupt, so we're going to have civil service reform, which says that you should get a job based off of passing a test and having merit and the ability to do that job, rather than just you get the job because of who you know. At the same time, the U.S. government is also very laissez-faire. They don't care about the people. So we have the formation of the Grange movement, the Farmers Alliance, and the Populist Party, which are all designed as citizens trying to make a change out of their government. As that's all going on, the rights of blacks in the post-Reconstruction South are going to be very restricted. We have the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which says that it's okay if there is segregation so long as the facilities are separate but equal. But those facilities are pretty much only separate and they are never equal. There was a bank panic in 1893 that nearly destroys the entire U.S. economy, and as a means of protecting our economy, and because the American frontier has been closed, Americans decide to conquer other nations or imperialize in order to save our economy and extend our influence worldwide. That's what happens in this chapter. I know it's a lot, but I promise you, once we get through chapter 21, we'll stop, we'll pause, and I'll kind of rebuild all of U.S. history, and then spoiler alert, we're going to have a major test. And then, once we've done that, we will continue the second half of the course, as far as I'm concerned, and go from World War I and move all the way up to the present day. I hope you guys have a very relaxing and restful break. Thank you for listening to this lecture and for doing some extra work over break. I know it's a lot. I know we don't get to take a lot of time for fun in this class, but it is all for a worthwhile goal. Have an excellent break, and I'll see you guys in 2014.